I am Liz Wharton. I am the VP of Operations with Scythe. I also help out with the ICS Village. So for some reason, they have asked me to be the adult in the room on this panel. And we're going to start from my left across the panel. We have Kevin Collier. Kevin's with NBC. We have Shannon Vavra, and she is with the Daily Beast. And then we have Joe kind of anchoring Washington Post, as well as I was teasing Joe. One of the things that he helps bring out is Cybersecurity 202, and they ask different industry executive or leaders different thoughts on things. So if we run short on questions and conversation, then what we're really going to do is help them brainstorm ideas for their next questionnaire that's going to go out to everybody. He's now very much regretting. So with that said, if everyone wants to take a second to just say hello, or do we want to just jump right in?
Let's jump in.
I think we jump in.
Awesome. So you always hear talk about the DC bubble. So when you step outside of, because your audiences and the public and the readers that you are writing to are not necessarily the DC bubble. So when we step outside, what do you hear? What is the state of or view of cybersecurity in general? I mean, because we can delve into ICS, but I don't think we get there first. I think we start big picture. So Kevin, you're on the hot seat.
Okay, we're going to just talk through this. Does this work? Okay. I can go actually ICS with this, I think, specifically, which is that your average viewer, and by the way, when I get like media training, they'll say, if I'm going to be on camera, I write more than I'm on camera, but when I'm on camera, they'll say, be aware that you need to talk in like clear, precise, ways with good examples. Your average person's watching, maybe with kind of half watching while they're doing something else. They got the TV on. So if I talk about ICS or SCADA or use acronyms like that or get too technical at all, I think your average person tunes out. At that same time, your average viewer absolutely is concerned about infrastructure. They're concerned about, so many people have asked me, is Putin going to turn on our lights? The spillover from the war in Ukraine. People care about, like, is their password strong enough? So there is very, very serious, broad care and very, very little engagement with getting precise and technical. And that's, I think, a crux of what the difficulty of our job is bridging that gap. But that's certainly what I live every day, and I assume this is the case for Shannon and Joe as well.
Well, okay. So Shannon, unfortunately, I'm going to feed off of that a little bit. How do you craft the language that you're using when you see an idea or something has piqued your interest? How do you shape it to the audience when it comes to this? How do you convey that the importance or the unimportance of, like, yeah, your password's probably fine, but this isn't?
Yeah, no, and thank you for having us. Is this loud enough? Can everyone hear me? Thank you for having us again. I think, speaking to what Kevin was just saying as well, is what regular people who aren't reading cybersecurity reports every day, they're not, in the weeds, what they care about is the bottom line. So if you can break it down into the bits and pieces for them that are going to make sense, where we do the back work saying, well, what does the piece of malware do? What does the DLL look like? How long has it been there? When did you first find out about it? What your average Joe or your friend wants to know is Russia going to hack the banks? Do I need to take my money out? I can't tell you how many questions I've gotten from people asking if they need to take their money out of the bank. This is more like in February at the very beginning of things. And you basically have to say, well, as many in this room might be more familiar, the financial industry has been much more hardened on average than other sectors, right? Everybody else doesn't necessarily know that because they haven't been tracking specific hacks, work between the NSA, Cybercom, and the financial sector for years. So if you say, well, there's history here, here's why you maybe are a little less worried about the financial sector compared to others, and just break it down a little bit that way. I think the basics.
Yeah, no. So now that we know that the banks are a little bit hardened, are more hardened than others, like, Joe, how do y'all craft when you're framing that? Are there things that, how often do you get, how should I change my password?
Yeah, I think that Kevin and Shannon have both hit this really well. Like, fear, that the view from the rest of America is fear, anxiety, misunderstanding. They don't exactly understand what a cyber attack is or what malware is. It's something they don't know how it happens. They don't know that 90% of it happens through phishing emails. They think it's just a thing that pops up on your computer screen one day. And so I think rarely has something been so important and so anxiety producing for the general public, but also so misunderstood and difficult to understand. So I think for reporters, the translating role is by far the most important. It's yanking a lot of things that can seem rather esoteric down to a level that's a broad understanding. And I mean, the ironic thing is that most of us are by far non-technical people here, and we're all going to you guys with as generalists who understand this just enough to ask the right questions, hopefully. And you guys, I know, spend a lot of time speaking to us like we're third graders, only so we can speak like third graders to the rest of the country.
Well, and that kind of brings up the other aspect of it is how much do you have to go? Do you seek out experts that you know, okay, they're going to be able to break it down, or, all right, this is an absolutely brilliant person on this topic, but I'm going to need a translator?
It's a tough one. I always try to, I understand way more than I'm going to be able to put in a story, because otherwise if I try to insert my own metaphors without having like a pretty solid understanding, it's, tends to not be a very accurate one. But yeah, it's a juggling act for sure.
I was just going to say, you have to do both almost every time, especially if it's a newer topic, right? Like if you're covering pipelines for the first time last year, as I don't know if it was the first time for any of us, but many of our colleagues maybe, especially in more mainstream outlets who haven't covered cybersecurity topics before, you have to do both, because you're not going to necessarily understand every little bit that's happening, and there might be questions that you might not have come up with yourself. So one of my favorite questions is, what am I not asking? What are other smart reporters asking? What did so-and-so forget in their report that I should be asking? Because rising tides will lift all boats. Like we can't be forgetful here or think we know everything at the outset.
And I'm also generally hugely impressed by the quality of threat researchers and their ability to explain things in very basic terms to reporters. Not 100%, but 70% or something, higher than I've found in other fields that I've covered. People tend to be pretty good at taking things down to basic levels. But yeah, the person who I can DM and say, hey, does this make any sense? What the hell does this mean? Am I explaining this correctly? Is just invaluable. And the people I found in this field who are willing to take time to do that to make me not sound like an idiot are just invaluable.
Yeah, I think we all have a small army of experts in a lot of related fields here, some of whom are at this conference, some of whom are in this room, who we just use as, for idiot checks all the time to make sure we're not, framing something incorrectly or framing something wrong. And it's, I think our mini industry of cybersecurity reporting would be drastically worse without them. So unsung heroes. Thanks.
No, absolutely. And that's the purpose of events like today, and to keep the conversation going. So what are some of the, you say you're asking the question, what am I not asking? But what are some of the things that you think, because again, today is bringing together industry and academia, but also the legislative, the political, the people making the rules, enforcing the rules, and coming up with the new regulations. What are some of the questions that you get and that you filter through that you don't see them asking? So what questions should they be asking, either press, academia? What are some of the things?
This is not entirely on point, but there are a lot of whats that they aren't asking, but there are probably more whens that they're not asking. I mean, so I started covering this in 2014. I started covering it, and the number of people on the Hill who understood much of anything about cybersecurity was Jim Langevin and maybe one or two others, depending on the topic. That's grown substantially since then, and it really jumped with Colonial Pipeline and this sense that this may really affect my constituents. But I think there were a lot of the few people who understood this were laying the groundwork for a long time until there was finally a useful crisis they could actually move some kind of legislation on it. They've done it now, but I think there's a sense that the moment of crisis may pass and this may not become the hot topic it is on the Hill anymore. sometime by the close of this Congress. So it's really more a matter of keeping attention on these things longer and in a more concerted and ongoing way.
I say, how many stories or pieces of stories have y'all started working on that then the public tide has shifted, or the concern, like there's something else that then gets cut and left on the floor? I mean, does it happen? Or either there was so much to put in that article that you had to leave out. In other words, when are y'all creating your own books and podcasts based on, movies? Do the director cuts? Like, this is the deeper cut of the article that I wrote or the story that I had on the evening news.
What I'll say to that is sometimes the best thing a reporter can do is circle back when the public attention has died down on something. The other day, this wasn't a cyber question, but the other day I was rereading an article from January 2022, this year, and I hadn't heard anything about this random investigation at some random agency I'm not going to mention. And we need to, it behooves us, and it is our responsibility to follow up even when the public may not be paying attention. That said, of course, there are bits and pieces I leave off of stories, right, to use as fodder in the next story. There will always be another one, and there's certain nuggets you can cut that aren't essential that can be useful as, starting downhill so you can still move uphill on your next story, I think, is my approach. But.
Yeah, one of the benefits of writing a daily newsletter is that I'm constantly leaving things off and then circling back to them later and tossing random things in where I think that they can fit. I mean, writing every day, you have a little more latitude than someone who's putting together a week's worth of work into one big story. So there are plenty of things that I've left out and that suddenly occurs to me, 3 months later when I'm desperate for something to write about and I start making phone calls on it.
And so when you're seeing this and you're kind of something piques your interest and you're going into your depth, how do you find new people to add to your, like, say, rotation of experts?
That can be really difficult because I'm sure I'm speaking for everyone in our job and related job, in that we are totally inundated with PR emails from people with startups that don't, they're claiming they have evidence of China doing this, that, or the other, or North Korea, or whatever. And you're like, I know you don't have the telemetry to do that. You just started your company last week. So a lot of it, honestly, is events, like events where you get to really meet people and kind of suss them out. I think this job would be a lot harder if there wasn't such a good sense of community among a lot of cyber folks. That I can get, I can talk to you and you can really recommend somebody for me. And that means a lot more than me trying to like blindly sift through marketing material to try to identify somebody.
But, it's all the AI, all the things, and the ML and left of boom and, what are some of the other ones?
Military grade, unhackable.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, unhackable, untraceable. Okay. Well, and so through events like this, how do you get the conversation started? Because I know there are certainly times where it's almost like the badge of like, oh, they're press. We have to run away. Like, we can't do that. But then at other times where it's like, no, I need to help them craft, or I need to introduce them. I will frequently tell people, spoiler alert, especially as my boss is sitting front row, I am not the smartest person in the room. I like to think that instead I can find the smartest people in the room and introduce them so you get that. So how do you start those conversations? Is it over coffee? We're like, gosh, wish they had better creamer for the coffee.
I'll start. I think one piece of advice I can offer for those in the room who have or have not spoken with press before is know how you might want to be attributed. For instance, not at all, but I can provide a gut check, or feel free to DM me or text me, but don't call, or whatever it may be. If you have ideas about how you'd like to be contacted or talked to, that really helps us, especially because we usually have an idea of what it looks like and it's hopefully on the record, but we also really do need those off the record gut checks sometimes. Those have saved stories that, unnamed sources that you'll never know have saved horrible stories that didn't get published because they just weren't right? Maybe we hadn't written them all the way, but we were about to. I don't know if I'm speaking for both of you
I
as
totally
well.
think that's fair. I think the vast majority of us are not going to take your words out of context. We're not going to quote you immediately without making clear that we're asking you to. You know, if I'm speaking with a member of Congress, then yes, I expect them to be on the record. If you're speaking to me just as a person who's familiar with the subject, you know, there's a lot more. We're having just a conversation here. You're not going to get got or whatever. Absolutely be really clear, like Shannon said. This is on background. You can put this on the record, just don't. But I think we're not going to burn anybody as a rule, and could often, you know, if you know something that we don't, that's how it gets to the public, and you can really help out if you do speak with us.
And I was just going to add, if you say on background, say what you mean by that, because everyone has a different understanding. Maybe I'm saying things you all know already. I don't know.
Yeah, there's I'm obviously biased here, but I think a great deal of unnecessary anxiety about talking with reporters, even like at the coffee stand, making conversation as if that's somehow going to end up in the next day's newspaper. And I've just never seen that happen in my life. You know, the disputes between reporters and sources about things that end up in print are 99% of the time public officials who say something stupid on the record that they shouldn't. It's not some conversation two people are having at a coffee stand or at a conference or whatever. You know, when the interview begins, ideally the reporter will be, you are welcome to be explicit about, you know, whether it's an on the record conversation, whatever else it is. But it's, we're very gentle people in general.
Sure. Lull us into a sense of complacency. You know, well, you talk about though, and especially as we start to ramp up into kind of conference season, and startups are always coming out, and everyone has ideas and the thoughts. How do you start to filter through the noise? Is it, if it comes in as a PR request, there's no way. Do you go immediately to the gut check, or do you have a bingo card of words where if you see the following words in a story or an email, you're like, no, but I did get bingo and I won $5 in the office pool?
When I have the benefit of, I just in general don't cover companies. You know, there are tech reporters who do that, and I'm relatively narrowly focused on cybersecurity and the policy and politics of cybersecurity. So a guy with a cryptocurrency startup is just not someone who I'm ever going to speak with. And the people I do speak with, it tends to be because they have, you know, genuine demonstrated expertise in a field that I'm going to be interested in. That's not to say I don't get several hundred emails a day pitching those people. I just don't open them.
I mark a lot of people's spam. Yeah. Yeah, I'm in a similar boat. Also, you know, I don't cover startups or even particular companies, except for, you know, when a particularly big company has a particularly important bit of research out. That's the only real exception. We tend to be as regular person focused as possible, and that often means really trying to just kind of ignore the hottest new thing in the industry is, you know, in favor of something that actually matters. I tried to beat the ransomware drum a whole lot because I felt like that was really impacting a lot of Americans' lives in a more direct way than, let's say, a lot of some industry stuff directly does, as an example. It's a tough question, though.
No, it is, and it's not fair. And one of the things that I always joke, and when I'm doing a presentation to kind of put stuff into context, I talk about cyber squirrel. That, you know, something goes down, it maybe wasn't Russian, Korean, Chinese APT taking down this. That maybe it was bad security practices that led to a squirrel electrocuting itself and taking out, I don't know, an airport's power supply on, I think it was Thanksgiving Day. That was a cyber squirrel attack. So how often or how quickly do you have to start kind of filtering through that some of the stuff, going, all right, maybe, because occasionally it is, but sometimes it's Agent Cyber Squirrel. I think I'm kidding. More wildlife, more turtles have hit aircraft, according to FAA reports, than drones have been reported. More red herrings which I want to know how the fish got up to hit the aircraft, but there have been more of those reported in the FAA's wildlife strike database so how do y'all do that?
Turtles are hitting planes?
Yes.
Are they flying turtles?
I don't know. The turtle doesn't survive.
And literal red herrings, not
Literal red,
figurative. Right.
exactly, not Lawyer Liz red herrings.
Right.
Actual red herrings. So if you ever get bored, the FAA keeps a wildlife database. So now you know. I'd like that to be on record that when you quote those stats, be like, Liz Wharton from Scythe ICS Village during Hack the Capitol informed us of this.
Well, it wasn't always the case that every news outlet had a dedicated cyber reporter. It pretty much is now. Does CBS count? Olivia, Fox. I don't know if you count that as a
shade.
Throw
No,
all
as
the shade you
having
want.
a dedicated cyber reporter. I'm not Fox. But now they do, for the most part. Most places do, and I think that's a substantial thing. Is that one of the most valuable skills as journalists, as opposed to other journalists who simply are not here or could attend things like this, is we know how to suss through or separate the wheat from the chaff, in that sense.
I would say it's constant triage too. Like, you'll generally have, I think we all have a bit of a different cadence, I think, for publishing, but I'll generally have a series of stories I know I'm working on, trying to confirm that kind of thing. But every morning, I will begin anew knowing there might be breaking news I have to cover. I might have to reach out to my 3 trusted, gut check sources, and then reach out for a comment to name any number of 3-letter agencies. Your day might get blown up at the morning hours when you wake up. It might get blown up in the afternoon too and ruin your evening, and you're working all night. But I think, for me, in terms of what I digest, it's everything from the Cybersecurity 202, different newsletters, what Kevin writes, what all our other colleagues write, Twitter, constantly looking at Twitter because a lot of people post little nuggets there, different hashes that are maybe interesting that are worth looking at. And otherwise, I think just going back to talking with sources, that's the best filter. Asking those questions, I know I already mentioned this, but asking, what am I not asking? What stories aren't being told? Because that's what's going to break through the noise later in a really, hopefully, interesting story.
Just following up on something that Kevin said about the smallness of this universe and cyber reports being a relatively new thing. There used to be like a dozen of us between two coasts, and now there are probably 24 or at most 36 out there who are dedicated solely to covering cybersecurity. And like by and large, I think we're all quite good and have spent our time. I have no beefs with anyone. But there's sort of thing about this universe of cyber reporters in that, most beats you will find that the people who work in that field believe they are broadly misrepresented by the media. And that's true of cyber folks as well. But I think we're in this sort of odd position where we tend to believe that too of the broader media, like we understand enough in order to translate things relatively well and not, blow things out of proportion, make the the scariest story out of Ukraine as opposed to the 10th scariest story out of Ukraine, and so forth. Whereas when it gets translated into broader media, that sometimes doesn't happen. And so we're in this weird kind of intermediary phase of often sort of being intermediaries both with the researchers themselves and with like the broader publications trying to get the fear and anxiety at the right level, but not the wrong level.
I would add to that too. When Russia started going after certain entities in Ukraine, everyone was publishing stories about the various DDoS attacks that were going on. Various attributions were coming out. They were trickling through. I think it took a couple of days for the U.S. to attribute. And I remember having to explain what a DDoS attack was. I've been at the Daily Beast since June of last year, but there isn't a dedicated cybersecurity editor. And I was like, we cannot write a headline that says massive, crippling cyber war is beginning. And I think there were various debates on Twitter that were happening about what even a DDoS attack is it an attack? And these are the conversations that are our responsibilities to translate those very nitty-gritty details that are still up for debate in the community. I think we ended up with some, cyber onslaught, not attack, just to hedge. But it's those kinds of things like the daily translation that we were talking about earlier.
I think that's the perfect example of a situation where, keeping the fear and anxiety at precisely the right level and explaining what a DDoS attack is and what it isn't, and whether there is, I think there was a full-blown cyber war headline in some publication about Ukraine. Mostly those headlines have been kept out of the media. We've sort of, I think, for once done a relatively good job of kind of right-sizing what we know and what we don't, and what the level of anxiety should be about cyber in the Ukraine conflict.
You're touching on something I think is just really fundamental to like our day-to-day, tough job is properly scaling things to be in the middle, where your average person thinks something, even other people in our news organizations might want to frame things as either absolutely devastating or not registering at all, when in reality, so much of things are somewhere in the middle, and trying to find ways to frame that as such that's so much of the battle.
Well, and I imagine the kind of conversations someone had posted on Twitter, like a thesaurus truck had turned over, and they were shocked, amused, amazed, and throwing out everything. And so how do you work within your own, I'd say networks, newsrooms, to go through and say, yeah, that one's a little much, but maybe this one? Or do you have like a wall of like no's, like whatever you do, this shall never be in a story or a descriptor? And do you have cyber pew pew maps? And if not, why not?
We don't have cyber pew pew maps, but my not everywhere that I've worked have I been matched with a really spectacular editor. I'm blessed to have one right now, and his background is not in cyber, but he's quick, and when he wants to push things too far, I say no, that's not accurate. We can't publish something that's not accurate, and we rein it in. There's a lot of dialogue, but that's part of the day-to-day co-working experience, is reining that in.
Sometimes if it's me writing it, again, that sort of daily translation back and forth, but other times it'll be messaging our breaking news team and saying, hey, if you're touching this, don't use this word because that is not right. And I think that's just constantly being aware of what are the fires we need to put out and letting everyone know.
Yeah, I've had good and bad editors in my career, and I'm lucky to have a good one now, and am able to pare back any language that's added to it. Interestingly, my editor now used to write, I write the Cybersecurity 202 daily newsletter. My editor used to write the Health 202 daily newsletter. And someone who's covered health policy is very sympathetic to the nuances of language you have to put into something. I think there's people who've been deep in a policy world, I think, get the way that language is necessarily nuanced and things like this.
So when there's breaking news or something that's coming out and it's moving lightning fast, how can industry experts do a better job of, maybe they're not on, or maybe they are your gut check, people, but what can we outside the press do better to help you get the right story balance?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I don't know if there's a right way for industry and the press to talk to each other. I mean, people have been working on this for decades, and I think there's always going to be, totally different motivations and totally different interests. So like, we're never going to be entirely on the right page. And I spend, 3/4 of my days, whether there's breaking news or not, overwhelmed by and irritated by the volume of email pitches that I'm getting, and then maybe 1/4 of it exceptionally grateful for like the very few wonderful things that come in that help me to right size a story or understand a story. And so the handful of people who, sometimes even people I don't know, who just DM me and criticize me and put me on the right track on something are immensely useful. And I don't know if there's any way of strategizing that kind of serendipity.
I think, again, just going back to the thoughts that it's a triage, right? If you have a conversation that's happening about pipelines, I'll pull up my mental list or physical list of all the people I know who work on pipeline security who I think could help me gut check. And then if I know I need to do a story, pick those people who I know are willing to speak on the record, who are also smart and invested in it. Because I guess this is maybe more of a difficulty outside of the generic cybersecurity context where people are more willing to just sort of pundit. I don't know if we get as much as that in the cybersecurity space, but making sure you have someone who really knows
No,
what you're
there
talking
are
about.
no pundits or people who like to grandstand in cybersecurity, ICS, or anything like that. Nope.
I like pundit as a verb. That was nice.
I would say that if something that's not exceptionally weird and incredibly specific and unique happens, like if another colonial happens, and we don't have somebody already on speed dial to talk to, or maybe even several, we've not done our jobs right. We've not prepped right. We should already know who all the, at least the major sectors of things that could happen, know who to talk to.
Well, and just to kind of build on what you were talking about, like going to those conferences, going and getting that initial touch, that initial conversation started of, hey, if you ever need this, here's this. And it sounds like Twitter is still, despite potential changes in ownership that may be going through, what are some other, you said you look at different newsletters, what are some other go-to places that you go other than the 202 and other, say, excluding anything that your networks put out?
Conferences I don't attend, or at least talks that I don't attend, I'll just look at who's talking about something. If something catches my eye, I often will reach out and just say hi to the person, and get to know them that way.
There you go.
I spend a lot of time on Twitter. I spend some amount of time reading threat reports, even if I don't write about them explicitly. And then I do, because I put a newsletter together and I have to wake up at 6 a.m. every day and make sure the right things are in it. I've got like an old-fashioned Google Doc with links in it that has, Shannon's byline and Kevin's byline and about a dozen others that I look at every morning to see what's new.
I'm flattered to know I'm in a Google Doc. I would just add to that list. I just lost my train of thought because that's so exciting to hear. Come back to me.
Absolutely. No, and because, there are certain reports that, not going to lie, the Verizon data breach report, I'm like, ooh, it's breach report release day. Like, oh, this is awesome. I'm going to watch every webinar on it, even just because you're getting that information. That there's information sharing has been one of the other collaborative themes of, I think, a lot of the talks today. So it's good to know that y'all do have kind of a resources for information sharing of, hey, do you ever hey, I've heard this, and we're going to assume the best motives, but do you ever hey, if y'all are hearing this, just so you know, total malarkey, it's already been debunked? Or are there others where you're like, have you seen this? I'm just going to anonymous mouse this over to you so that you write this terrible story.
I've definitely experienced people I trust telling me that they found serious problems with a given report that's making waves, and I'm always very grateful for that. I don't want to necessarily say something is authoritative when it's not. So.
Likewise, and I remembered my thought, which is sometimes just again sort of to get beyond a bit of the daily news, looking at who's recently left an organization that I might want to talk to. Scrolling through LinkedIn, doing that kind of search is always very helpful.
LinkedIn is an insane resource. It's absolutely, if you can't get through to a company, this is less relevant for when we're talking about cyber research. But if there's a company that you want to know what they're up to, the ability to look through former employees or current employees and mass message 100 of them in an hour, it's unbelievable that this exists. I don't know how this exists, but it does.
That's why Chinese intelligence is on it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well,
That's a reason.
I mean, if I want to know or see trends, I think in risks, or if I'm a product, if I see a company doing a lot of hiring in their legal department for trademark stuff, I'm like, oh, what do you have going on? Or they're hiring a lot of litigators that handle certain things. I'm like, oh, hello. What are you afraid of that's about to come out? So I'm glad to know I'm not the only one who stalks LinkedIn for different things. But no, and I know everyone who's sitting out here, and I wish we had a better interaction for folks at home. But this is a dialogue. This is a conversation, a discussion. Y'all been doing great. But this is kind of the 30-second warning for everyone out there to start thinking of what are some of the questions you have? What are some of the, burning, pressing, how can they do better, or I say do better, but how can they filter through the noise? What are some of the stories that you've seen or just questions you may have. So start thinking of those. And if you want to raise your hand, we will repeat the question and then ask of the panel. And if y'all thought you were getting away with a mid-afternoon panel where you have 3 engaging speakers, think again. This is not, and Bryson, I know you have stuff that is top of mind. But with that said, again, so what are some of the topics that come up at the dinner table? I'd say dinner table, but like think of family holiday or something where you're just like, oh, this again. Are there family? Do you ever avoid family texts, calls, DMs where you're like, oh, mom saw the story. Yep, was expecting her to reach out for that. Or no, you're fine to drink the water this week. But do you have any favorites that stick out of, I'd say, war stories of, yep, this was a particularly, like you said, in February when everyone is, it's everywhere, all over the news. It's imminent, not realizing it was going to be more of a long haul.
I'm just sort of amazed by the way in which this field has entered the ether. I mean, whether people get the nuance and the details or not. And I think my first experience with it was Sony when I came home for, was it Christmas or Thanksgiving? I forget which, but came home. And I'm sitting at the kitchen table, and I was like the one left over as a Politico at the time who was still working, still putting out a newsletter, because for some reason we had to have a Christmas Eve Politico Pro cybersecurity newsletter. Putting that together and doing radio hits in various parts of the country, and my mom is asking me questions in between all of this and knows all of the details. I mean, she was getting all of this straight through MSNBC. She had all of it down. And then there have been a handful of those since then. But ransomware, again, was the other big one where everywhere I went, people were talking about it. People were asking about it. My brother-in-law was talking about the price of gas in Greensboro, South Carolina, being affected by it. I mean, it was just sort of in the world in a way that these issues tend not to be. And I can only presume that will happen more and more often going forward.
I would add to, I was fortunate enough between 2 jobs to take a little unplug, which as a reporter, I think turning off notifications is the rarest form of joy and beauty and actual vacation, because so often vacations don't include that. But I really turned off most notifications. And I said, I'm going to leave whatever it was, Apple News or New York Times or something, for really emergent situations. And the only stuff that broke through was ransomware news. And I was like, that's so funny because that's my beat. And now I feel like I'm missing out. And it took all in me to only read one article and really try to unplug. But that kind of goes to what Joe's saying here, which is mainstream media outlets and what Kevin was saying earlier really do have cybersecurity reporters focused on it. And a lot of news outlets have reporters in the White House briefing room who maybe don't cover cyber every day asking questions that aren't right on the nose, which I think gets to something we were talking about earlier, which is how can we ask better questions? And I think, some of my favorite ones that I would love to hear more of are, what's your confidence level for that? How do we know that? And if you put it in a story, you can't just say, oh, the NSA attributed it to the GRU. Well, how? What's the evidence? Did they share it? No. So, and that's the kind of thing that I think it's our responsibility to tell our audiences that, because there's only so much we can know, and there's always going to be pieces of information we won't, that leave these sort of mysterious questions left for us to continue asking.
So, and kind of getting to that, how often do you have to leave something out because the attribution, like, in your heart of hearts, this is where it is, this is what it was, but you can't quite get that person or that detail nailed down, because we know with cyber and everything, it's 100% all of the time. I mean, there's never multiple ways to interpret the same piece of it and then walk that fine wire. But like, how do you reach the tipping point when you're mid-story of writing it, of saying, okay, yep, this was enough here. Oh, this one, I know this is what it is, but I just can't get it. It's like, how does that conversation go in your head?
I like to get granular, which isn't always popular for editors, especially if you're trying to talk to an audience that's a little more mainstream. For instance, if there's a specific hash that matches something from Charming Kitten 3 years ago, I would mention that, right? If that's the only piece you have, right? So, and that's just one random example off the top of my head. If there's indications, maybe it's something from Russia, but we don't know which APT group it is. Maybe you explain who the APT groups are and you mention your sourcing on the first tip. But I think every time it's just going through the checklist of, are there two people saying the same thing? Are there three people? Who are they? How invested in it are they? How close are they to truth here?
There's also, I think, a fairly clear small group of places that have reliably done really solid attribution, and you certainly get a track record. And I absolutely would not trust a company that does not have an established track record's attribution without an exceptionally, well articulated reason why, if it was not corroborated by another, reputable attributor.
Yeah, I don't envy that filtering through, because of course occasionally folks get it wrong, and sometimes it is the craziest out there theory that, oh, that was true. Like, who would have thunk? It really was Cyber Squirrel. I'm telling you, Cyber Squirrel does so much. But opening up the floor, if anyone has any questions for the panel, feel free, raise a hand. Bryson, I'm going to put you on the spot because I know you would call on.
No, that's fine.
He had his own microphone.
He has his own microphone. It's the advantage here. So, what was your favorite story, right? Not like what was the big story, because, you all kind of dogpile them because those become the things that catch the interest. But what was personally your favorite story in this, and why?
I would say I have a couple ransomware stories that I've done about them affecting real people. Parents dealing with their kids being sent home during the pandemic because hackers had closed their schools, that sort of thing. Nurses dealing with the stress of not knowing when they're going to, be able to use their hospital systems. Employees of companies that were staffed through Kronos, which suffered a pretty bad ransomware attack at the end of last year, who were missing paychecks and what that meant for their everyday lives. I'm proud of those. You get to talk with, everyday Americans and see how the very real cyber affects their lives. I think that's important, and that gives me a lot of satisfaction.
I'll say two. One of them was about, I got a tip from a source who mentioned there seemed to be a front company in Canada for a ransomware group, or two ransomware groups in Russia. Not much to go on there, so I got permission from my editor to take a fair chunk of every week to work on it. Finally got it published last fall, maybe. I'll encourage you all to read it because it is a fun little ride, and I ended up finally finding this person who ended up founding this company, and then seems to have had his domain taken from him by this appears to be a front company. So that's one. My other is, I think it was 2019 or 2020. Cybercom had employed a graphics firm to create different graphics portraying Russian hackers and Chinese hackers. And I just asked around about it a little bit, and it turned out that Cybercom was intending to sort of intimidate the Russians and get their bosses mad at them. And that was a really fun story to report out, and I wish I could do more of those.
Yeah, I'm echoing Kevin. There have been a handful of situations where I've been able to write stories about, and it's usually ransomware because that's where you get closest to real human beings, but the ways that ransomware has affected people on pensions whose pensions were entirely messed up because of the hack in at Baltimore school district, people working for cities who struggled through ransomware attacks, and working for schools who struggled through ransomware attacks. I think this beat tends to be a little divorced from the individual human experience, even though like the meat of it comes down to the way this is affecting human experience. And so times when you can do that, I think, is great. And then the other one is, this is quite a few years ago now, but I wrote a story about an oft-cited cyber statistic that had been cited in numerous bills, had been cited by federal agencies and so forth. It was that 60% of small businesses hit with ransomware attacks will go out of business within 6 months. The statistic was made out of thin air in an entire accident, I was able to find out. And that was fun to just shed a little light on some of the absolutely false and insane things that float through the cyber ecosystem. And I still hear that statistic every like 2 months, probably. It hasn't died.
They never do. The ones that are just absolutely outrageous seem to never, ever. But I promise you, the turtles and drones is absolutely because I will get bored and I will go through the wildlife database of what is the craziest thing that moose or another thing. Just throwing that out there. But so how do you kind of, like when you hear these things, like, is there some sort of temptation? Like I said, the cyber pew pew map of like, this is a great, like, this sounds so crazy out there. I almost want it to be true, but you have to start peeling back the onion.
I would say in my experience, and this is one I bet again attributes or is true for all of us, is that the story ideas you come up with, having conversations with people, either regular people or people in the industry, are almost always better story ideas than one somebody tries to like deliver to you on a silver platter through an email, through a marketing company.
One other favorite story of mine that you both reminded me of was at the beginning of the pandemic. I was covering a lot of stalkerware. So malware, if any of you aren't familiar, that's used particularly in romantic relationships to intimidate and abuse partners. And I wondered, as partners live together and are quarantined, what does that do to stalkerware? Does it go up? Does it go down? And that was a really interesting story. And the stats were mixed. And we pulled from various companies that do track it. But there was one woman who was employed by a company who, from working from home, they had found stalkerware on one of her devices. And that brought up a lot of questions about what's the responsibility at a company to inform your employee about potential stalkerware. Does that make the situation worse? So that was that got personal. And I think it's hard to find those things sometimes.
So what are some of the stories, you talked about your favorites, what are some of the stories over the last couple of slides as the ransomware, we hear about all these different attacks, what are some of the stories that really just stuck with you? That maybe you didn't like the thing, but it just writing that story, the process, like that's something you won't forget.
One that's kind of has stuck with me a lot is, and this goes back farther than Shannon, it may go back farther than Kevin, but I was maybe a little less than a year into covering cybersecurity when Sony happened. And what was really interesting about that is, it was maybe the first, maybe the second time that all of a sudden the president is talking about this at a news conference, and it's a huge deal. But one of my strongest memories from that time is I was at an event, maybe Bipartisan Policy Council, but there were two real bigwigs up there, either current or former officials, saying that this was, a terrible brazen attack on the United States that must be responded to. And I asked the question, well, why? And one of them said, because they destroyed data. And when you destroy things, that's far more important than disruption. We need to draw a red line. The other said, no, it's because this affects the First Amendment. They're trying to inhibit the free speech of the filmmakers. This must be responded to. This is about basic American values. And then they just sort of moved on. And I wondered, well, if we're not really clear on why this is such a major event, that signals a lot of concerns going forward. And so that was just a fascinating moment for me, but it was, I think, a real harbinger of things to come about how this thing is going to move a lot faster than our normal processes and our normal ideas do. And we sort of have to get our larger ideology in check and into place in some way, or it's going to outrun us.
So Kevin, what stuck with you, that, or a story that, or maybe an attack or something that just, that was maybe not a game changer, but it just stuck with you?
Well, the Gucci for Two stuff was the real paradigm shift, I think, in my career. Just like how this is the relevance of what this area is for the general public. We have a foreign nation using hack and leak and deceptive techniques to influence our presidential election. To me, that's one of the single most fascinating things about the cyber realm, I guess, is that the whole gray area where nations are, instruments of one state are directly addressing and trying to affect individual citizens of another. It's just mind-blowing. This was
6 years ago, and it's still a really wild idea. And so every iteration since then, I think, has been fascinating.
No. Well, thank you all so much. I mean, your words have an impact, and we appreciate all that y'all do and look forward to, please come up and find all of our panelists, keep those conversations, help them ask their better questions and us. But anyway, thank you so much for joining today, sharing your time, and for ICS Village and all the other Hack the Capital sponsors for keeping this conversation going.